Hello and welcome, everybody. It is International Podcast Day 2017. Make sure you're out there using and searching hashtag International Podcast Day. This hour, we are extremely excited to welcome a group of podcasters from South Africa making a debut on the International Podcast Day event and stream. So thank you to our upcoming 4 guests. Our main host is Alan Versfeld. He is the host and producer of the Urban Astronomer podcast. He is also an amateur astronomer, an IT professional, a podcaster, a father of 5 beautiful kids, and a barely competent chess player. I love that. He is also the director of the astrophotography section of the Astronomical Society of South Africa, where he coordinates and promotes the activities of people who are far better photographers than him. And during this next 50 minutes, you'll be hearing about podcasting to a developing audience. Before we get to that, I really wanted to thank our sponsors of International Podcast Day. Blueberry is a full-service podcasting company, a turnkey solution that will allow a new or veteran podcaster to get set up and running within 15 minutes. Get started at blueberry.com. Studio 21 Podcast Cafe is a full-service cafe with 2 working podcasting and video casting studios. The grand opening happens September 30th, where they'll be broadcasting live throughout the day. Learn more and visit them at studio21podcast.cafe. The Messengers, a podcast documentary, is a journey through the modern world of podcasting, uncovering the magic behind why podcasters do what they do. Get your copy of The Messengers in iTunes and on Amazon by visiting themessengersdoc.com. And Potable, are you looking for your next favorite podcast? Potable revolutionizes podcast discovery by providing podcast recommendations tailored to you specifically. Start by going to play.potable.co. That's play.podable.co. And finally, thank you to the Audacity to Podcast, Modern Life Podcast Network, and Podbean. Well, Alan, thank you for joining our event. I'm glad we connected online. It is great to have yourselves and a cast of podcasters and friends from South Africa. Welcome. How are you all doing tonight?
I think we're doing great. We just managed to avoid a thunderstorm pass by, so you will be able to hear us.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, I will get out of your way. It's 11 p.m. South African time, so I'm really excited that you guys decided to stay up, push through right until the end of International Podcast Day. Thank you for joining. We look forward to hearing what you guys are going to be contributing today.
Great stuff. Well, guys, I don't know if you guys want to introduce yourselves. I mean, I'm Alan, obviously. I've been introduced. Who's next? Richard.
Hi, I'm Richard. I am effectively I term the producer of a local computer gaming podcast in South Africa called the NAG Podcast, which we produce once a week on a Friday morning, or at least it broadcasts once a week on a Friday morning.
Penguin.
Yeah.
All right. All right, I'll go. I'm Andrew, better known as Penguin Online. I'm one of the co-hosts of the NAG podcast, often bringing gaming news to a lot of the gamers here locally in South Africa.
Cool. And then the rose amongst the thorns. I'm Chantal, better known as Shani ZA Online, and I am the YouTuber that brings a little bit of spunk and personality to said gaming podcast, and I'm getting side eyes from both my co-hosts. But yeah, that's what we do, and that's what I do, I guess. Excited to be here.
Stuff. It's good to have you guys helping, because at that intro you mentioned 2 things I'm not very good at. One of them being astrophotography and the other chess. The third thing is, well, podcasting. I've only been doing it for a little while, so I thought I really do need to bring somebody who's got more experience, and it's good to have you guys here, really, really. Otherwise, I would have been stuck for an hour chatting.
Experience is very exciting.
So what is your show about?
We effectively sum up the gaming news and the esports news weekly for the South African audience, specifically focusing on stuff that we see having a lot of zeitgeist in South Africa. So we are able to sort of project our local take and our local flavor onto a very international stage, and that is gaming and esports. So, it's allows us to really target specific audiences that way. And when we started it, when we created it, there wasn't really a market, or wasn't really an offering in the market that provided what we were able to provide. And we started on a much smaller sort of media house, and then we moved to what was traditionally a print magazine that's moved online, and they hold the biggest sort of gaming and electronic entertainment expo in South Africa, which happens next week, called Rage, which sort of sees about 20,000 visitors to the Coca-Cola Dome in Joburg, which is one of the big concert venues effectively, and they fill it out. So we aligned with them in about April last year. We were on episode number 59. So we've been going for quite a while.
Yeah, it's more than a year. That's not bad going. I think I'm on episode 18 with the Urban Astronomer. So, mind you, I'm not releasing every week. I do it on my own, and I have too much real life in my way. So
don't you hate it when real life gets in the way of what you actually enjoy doing?
Yeah, exactly. Well, I shouldn't speak too loudly much.
I suppose being a father of five, also kind of gets in the way at sometimes of things. But I mean, it must be quite fulfilling at times.
Yeah, I wouldn't give it up for the world, you know. It sounds like a cliche, but it's absolutely true. But at the same time, yeah, it's expensive. And not just in money, in time and energy. I'll tell you what, though, I don't have a gym membership. I just wrestle 5 kids all the time, get them into bed or get them ready for school. Or great fun. Yeah. So I was actually curious to know now, I see you're looking quite professional setups you got going there. Who runs your podcast? I mean, do you use a hosting company, or do you guys do it in-house, do it yourselves? How does that work?
I produce it from a level of I write a sort of a very loose script once a week, and that we record it. Well, we record it a couple of ways depending on sort of what we're aiming for. At the moment, we're just sort of starting to move over to video as well as an accompanying audio podcast. So we have been using TeamSpeak up until now, which we found sort of in our limited bandwidth environment actually works the best for recordings when we're not all in the same room. But recently, moving over to video, we're finding Skype is a better solution for recording. In terms of distribution, we use Podbean as a hosting company for it. I have tried SoundCloud in the past. I've tried a couple of other ones, but I think for me, it really the technical stuff and having to spend a lot of time setting up RSS feeds and running it through a WordPress plugin and all that sort of stuff. I mean, it's just not something you want to be focusing on, So sure, you're paying a tiny bit of a premium to have a hosting company that is specialized for podcasts, but at the end of the day, that really is worth it. Like with the amount of time that you're saving by not having to use that stuff. And my most important thing for me is that the embedded player looks good, and Podbean's embedded player looks like the start of all of them.
Okay, now that's interesting, because I've taken the opposite approach. I do everything. I have my own servers, which I've gone instances, and I'm running WordPress, and I'm running the what's Blueberry's one? I think it's which is hilarious because they're one of the sponsors for this whole thing. Now I've forgotten their product. But I suppose it's each to their own, It depends on what you're up to and what you're interested in doing. So do you just record it then on the air? I mean, online, or are you each recording your own an audio and then sending it in? Or
the chat room says PowerPress is what you're looking for as the.
Thank you very much. Yes.
Thank you, JD Sutter.
I was just testing. Yeah. No. And okay.
Not all heroes wear capes in the end of the day.
We sort of aim to get a half an hour product out at the end of the day. Our recordings probably take around about 50 minutes. I'm not less lenient in the amount of dead airspace and tangents and that sort of stuff that I put into the final product in audio form than I am in video. Video seems to be more interactive, and we get more time to kind of go off on tangents, and because you can see our reactions and it's more visual, so people tend to engage more with it. Whereas the audio is much more sort of on point, and we have a specific amount of time. I try to keep it around half an hour because that's our average commute time. Well, I'd like to say in Cape Town. I know you guys are a bit longer up north, but so I try and keep it within that time frame, because then it fits nicely into a commute and people aren't breaking it off. You're not having people stop 10 minutes to go, to the end when they get to work, etc. So it's very, quite tight in how I allow the audio to go.
And also, just to add to that, Richard, if you think about the content that we're talking about, it's a wrap-up of the gaming news that week. So yeah, we could go on a tangent for an hour, which we often do, but you also don't want to hear about, we pick out the highlights, essentially, I guess. So that's what we do.
I mean, also, you really want to be thoughtful to your audience, especially here in South Africa, because one of the biggest concerns is data costs here as well, where to actually get any sort of data is hugely expensive here compared to everywhere else. I know that Larry earlier on during the podcast day mentioned that it's about $1 for 250 megs in Zimbabwe, which I think is roughly what we are paying here. I think maybe we get about 500 megs for that single dollar.
Yeah.
So I mean, that's one of the biggest restrictions here as well.
Yeah, no, that's a very real problem, and especially, well, I don't know how common my situation is. I don't even live in the city, so my options are limited. Amazed to find that I actually have an LTE signal. I think we were tweeting about this just now, moaning about how the bad weather was going to kick me off and I was going to completely miss out. But yeah, no, it's so yeah, it's the same concern I've got. I tried compromise on my audio quality, maybe compress it at a higher rate, and then just try and keep those recordings not too long and not too big to download.
What do you find is the sweet spot between sort of? I mean, I assume you're using MP3 as a compression.
Yeah.
So what do you find the sweet spot? What sort of bitrate do you use?
I tend to fall back to 128K and I keep it fixed, and that's just for maximum portability. You can make it variable, but then you might have issues with a funny player somewhere. If the recording's getting big, I might even drop it down to 64, because for spoken word it sounds a bit tinnier, a bit more like a telephone, but you can still hear what's being said, and that's what matters really the most. I mean, audio quality is important, but content beats quality, if that makes sense.
Yeah, sorry, while you were talking, I was just looking at what audio quality I use, because I've actually forgotten. I've actually set mine at 192, so it's a bit higher than yours. But I also think, I mean, based on our statistics, it sort of makes more sense for us to use that sort of the higher content, because a lot of our users listen through the embedded player and not many mobile, which is I know sort of out of the ordinary, and most people expect their higher numbers to be on mobile.
You see, that's a concern, because my actual listeners are mostly overseas, which is a problem for me, because my target audience it's South African, and specifically it's South African sort of school age, university age. With the topic being astronomy and South African astronomy, who are considering this as a career, and I want to let them know that this is something you can do. So I need the diverse audiences, and most importantly, I need to recognize that probably 90% of our population have got no money for bandwidth and have got terrible options available. So I've got to keep it small for them.
That's very true.
Yeah, all this heavy stuff I've got to worry about. Takes all the fun out of the job. But anyway, you're going to be serious about it. So you need to think about these things. Question, what size audience are you guys reaching? Because mine is small.
I don't like to discuss metrics too much in public, but as a metric, well, comparative metric, I use esports broadcasts, which are sort of our niche markets live broadcasts, and I use that as a comparison to how many people I reach, and I reach it and exceed it by around about 700%. So I like to consider us doing quite well. And I know, I mean, comparative to international numbers and comparative to, the media house podcasts and the radio station soundbit podcasts, we are not doing as well. But I mean, in numbers wise, about 4,000 downloads a month, give or take.
Okay, yeah. So I've still got a while to catch up.
Oh, but you've only been going for a little while though, so it makes sense.
Also, audiences may be too diffuse, you know. You guys are gaming and it's sports. This is technology people. They're probably more aware of podcasting to start with. And
You'll be surprised.
Yeah, I think you would be surprised.
You'd be really surprised because I've come across people that are like, so like, what do you do? Like, no, every now and again I'm part of a podcast. Oh, so you do radio? No, there's a big difference between podcasting and
I think we're probably all guilty of eventually just going, yeah, I do radio. Like, you know, we just eventually give up and just accept it.
That's what I have to revert to. That's what I have to revert to with explaining to my friends and family, because they're like, so what do you do? I'm like, I make YouTube videos of myself. I do a podcast. And then they're like, wait, what's a podcast? I'm like, it's like an online radio show, but not really. Oh, so which frequency are you on? No, it doesn't work that way. It's
I always try to explain it as like YouTube is to TV what podcast is to radio, and then then the lights sort of starts to come on in their eyes, you know.
But only a little bit, like that awkward, weird, dimmer, like that they use in the horror movies.
So how do you guys get that audience? I mean, how do you get them to find you?
We were lucky enough to align ourselves with a big gaming media company, or a company that, like I said, that used to be a print magazine, who's now an online company that run a big expo. So we had a natural audience, or at least an exposure to a potential audience that we could take and we could, you know, run with. So we've used a lot of social media, a lot of brand alignment with the brand that we align with, and we luckily haven't had to resort to things like paid advertisements and like Google AdSense and Facebook promoted posts and promoted tweets and that. So I mean, our sort of launch, we had the luck of having 20,000 likes on a Facebook page to launch with. So we had a huge amount of potential audience to tap into before we even got started, and that made a huge difference to the numbers that we saw. So we didn't really have a rolling start so much as our listener base has actually somewhat declined in the last maybe year. But when I say decline, I'm talking like 5%. But we started off with the audience ready to accept us, so that made a huge difference. So for us, it was very different to the norm.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's interesting. I haven't had that advantage, but I am seeing a slow but very steady growth. You know, an individual episode might spike the traffic for a while, but in general, I mean, I'm a small fraction of what you guys are getting in. By international standards, I think I've just lost in the noise. You know,
we are.
But at the same time, you know, it's not that how can you put it? It's not that I feel I'm wasting my time. You know, I am reaching an audience and I am getting feedback. So maybe that's an encouragement for other people wanting to start out. You don't have to crack the big time straight away.
And you know, I guess that's the best part. You'd rather have, just to dumb the numbers down for me, who's really bad at maths, you'd rather have 10 engaged listeners than 30 who click onto your podcast link for some unknown reason, listen for not even a minute, and then drop off again. So you'd rather have that engaged audience. So smaller, but more retained, I guess.
I think I don't think I have a sort of minimum threshold as to where, like, oh, if my audience drops like underneath this amount of people, I'm going to stop podcasting. Like I'm happy to do it for 20 people that really enjoy what I'm doing and appreciate what I'm doing. But I mean, the bigger those numbers are, the better, because it allows us to get our message out to more people. And we have the luxury of not needing sponsorship and stuff like that because of the media house we're aligned to. But I think it's really important is that you're engaging with people, and podcasting does kind of feel like a very one-way street, like you're kind of talking to into the wind, and sometimes you don't get a lot of feedback. And even with sort of 1,000 odd people listening to every episode, we get 5 people mention that they listen to us like a month, you know. So it's a very like one-way street, and that can be disheartening, and it can sort of kill your drive to improve and be better. But as long as you get those 5 people, and every time you do get a person go, hey, I listened to your podcast, awesome, you're like, wow, okay, well, I guess I'll do better next week then.
We actually, last episode we did, sorry, I'll cut you off there, but the last episode we did was the first episode we ever included a Q&A where we asked our audience, send us your questions on Twitter, and we actually answered like 5 or 6 of them, which was really, it was different. It wasn't just our usual, cool, we're going to do the gaming news. We actually had audience questions, which were all gaming related, but still, it was a first.
I've had some negative feedback, which was very exciting. It was lovely.
Yeah,
I was
it's
one of my
in a different way.
Well, this I kind of asked for. I because it's a science podcast. One of my early episodes, I dealt with people who believe in the flat Earth, and I didn't pull punches. This is great. If these guys can start moaning, then obviously someone's listening, right? And they did. Which was fun.
And they made their voices heard.
They sort of made these unintelligible grunts heard, because I don't know what these guys are like in real life, but yeah, I don't know who's listening to this now, so if I offended you, then I'm so sorry. Please, go ahead, hit me with your best shot, give me your best arguments, and if you actually have an argument that isn't just you suck, you're an idiot, you're being paid by NASA, if you have an argument, by all means, I'll happily address it. I'll even speak to you politely and respectfully.
While we're on that, if anybody is getting paid by NASA, please give me the contact, because I will gladly say that it is flat for some cash.
Yeah.
I think that's one of the important things as well, is engaging with your audience is also a really key way to grow a podcast. When you're kind of in an environment which doesn't always allow for like live engagement like this.
Yeah, it's weird to have a chat window for a change. Like, that never happens. That's weird.
I should probably open mine. Hey, see if I'm getting any reactions to my baiting there.
No people have come at you guns blazing with their opinions yet. So you're safe for now.
I suppose it's the wrong time.
You're safe for now.
They seem to hover on social media and just search for keywords, and then just they act like bots, except I'm pretty sure they're not. Very strange crowd. Yeah.
So JD is saying that one of his clients just had one of his first 1-star rating on iTunes, and it about ruined his day. So I would like to say that, yes, as much as negative feedback, sometimes it's a troll, or sometimes it's just someone that's either jealous of you or is not a fan and is just like, oh, I don't care about you and your podcast or whatever. It's also really important to remember that that's one person's opinion, and as much as there might be one dislike or one negative comment, there might be 5 positive comments, or 5 people saying, oh, but we really love the content you put out. So it's important to remember not to let the negative stuff get to you, because we live in the age of social media where everyone is a keyboard warrior, and that's
true.
It's reality.
Yeah, the fact that people can also hide behind being anonymous online is also a big thing. So it allows people to actually just go. But, if they listen to the whole podcast, then is there still really an issue? Because often you'll probably find that they're just jealous. They haven't decided to try and do what you're doing.
Honestly, I think when it comes to online stuff, like it's a novelty to us still to have this place where we can just go and have our opinions heard. And honestly, not everybody should have their opinions heard, because some people don't deserve the platform. But I think as time goes by, the toxicity that we're experiencing online is going to get less and less. It's either going to go that way, or it's going to get more and more, because as controversy sort of as a point becomes less controversial, people step up to try and become more controversial, and it's just like this big rolling snowball that gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And as stuff becomes acceptable, people just become more irrationally offensive, and it's going to get to a point where this sort of stuff is either just going to be lost completely, or we're actually going to start to get to a point where negative feedback is really valuable. Because at the moment you get 5 pieces of negative feedback, and maybe one is better than, oh, you suck. And I can't wait for negative feedback to actually be usable and useful.
If nothing else, it's that positive. What's that old saying? There's no such thing as bad publicity. People are listened to enough to have an opinion and to be moved enough to go to the effort of digging out the review section. And even if they're angry with you, it's because you said that one thing that they didn't like, and they're not judging your quality.
Trigger
They're
warning.
just upset with, yeah, exactly. I get very political on Twitter because I get all worked up and upset about what that. But and if I stood in here, I'm sure I'd polarize my audience, and half of them would say they hate me, and they would then keep listening to pick up what outrage I've said this week. Maybe they would just unsubscribe and move on to another show, and that's fine, I suppose.
But they're still
yeah.
listening, and that's the biggest
and it's not
thing.
something to
They're
take
still
personally.
listening. Exactly.
So just to bring it back to the sort of developing audience South Africa feel to it, I don't know if this is a global trend, but in here we have this thing where radio stations and media houses and the news houses create these sort of bits of their shows. So a DJ will have, say, a 3-hour show on a radio station, and he'll take a couple of bits of 5 minutes where he had a good section, or he had a chat with somebody, and they'll push it out onto their website, and they'll call that a podcast. And in this audience, we have a lot of this sort of thing and because they call it podcasts, people in our market sort of assume that to be a successful podcast and to be a podcast people need to pay attention to, it should be coming from a big media house. So when you're a small independent person or somebody that doesn't belong to one of these media houses or radio stations, it's a strange concept for them to be listening to somebody who just kind of had an idea and sat down in their study one day and decided, I know, I'm going to record something that somebody might listen to. So I think this is one of the things that I think we should, as podcasters in this sort of climate and our audience, and like I said, I'm not sure if it's global, but it's something that as podcasters we actually need to start doing, is starting to educate people on what the podcast is more broad than just, it's a bit of audio from somebody who's super famous that felt like this was a good 5 minutes of his show and decided to put it online.
And I think you'll find globally. Sorry, yeah. Globally, I mean, I'm taking over. Yeah. Sorry. I was going to say that globally, your big podcasts, your big shows, stuff like Serial, for example, they are produced by big media houses, professionals in radio who then move into the podcast space. What are some other good examples? Freakonomics Radio,
Life, all the BBC stuff, and all that. But that's produced specifically for a podcast medium. It's not sort of a broadcasting that has turned into a 5-minute soundbite from a show. Yeah,
for sure. But I think that the professionals are always going to dominate, just because they've got the talent on hand, they've got the staff, they've got the budget for a proper studio, they've got the marketing angles. But it doesn't mean that we're cut out. I think that they will have their gigantic segments, and because this is, it's the long tail, right? This was the big deal with internet marketing 10, 15 years ago. We're reaching the entire planet in people, because not everybody has internet, but billions, right? So if we get a percent of that, I'm not going to do the maths because it's now 11:30 at night and I'm tired. But it's a lot of people, and it's enough to be worth talking. Sure, you might not attract the big sponsorship deal, but if you're doing this just for the money, then it's like writing. You don't become a novelist to get rich. You might get rich from it, maybe, if you're lucky, but that's a dumb reason to start it.
I think that's a reason why we, as well, the three of us, put a lot of time and effort into social media, and in particular Twitter, where we find a more educated audience as to what podcasts are and what they represent and how they can be consumed. And especially in our landscape with our subject, it's people with incredibly short attention spans who expect things to be interactive or to be visual, or so to engage with them in an audio format or even in a video format becomes quite difficult. So a lot of our marketing comes down to being interactive and being in people's faces, so that as they get to know you on a personal level or as a person, that your opinions become valid to them. And that's really where I find the most success in getting listeners and getting engaging listeners. Is by appealing to them as a person. So sort of making yourself into a brand that people can respond to and appreciate your opinions.
Also, to add to that, I've noticed just specifically the way that we tweet out because our podcast will go live 8 o'clock on a Friday morning, is the difference between the three of us tweeting out the link to share it is completely different for each of our audiences. I will share and have, I don't want to say a clickbait title, but something to lead on with a point from the news that I found really interesting that I think my audience will click the link for, is completely different to what Andrew or Richard's links will be about. So it definitely has a lot to do with, we become personalities within the bigger podcast, I guess, and the different audiences are definitely there to reach into and tap into when you share stuff.
Yeah, we're bigger than comfortable silences, aren't we? So where should we take this then? I don't know.
What got you into podcasting and what made you decide to start doing a podcast? And as I say that, the thunder comes rolling in. Hello. But what got you deciding? Because I've noticed you have I want to call it a blog. Obviously, you're very versed in a lot of different things, but did you move from the blog and say, okay, well, this is cool, but let me do an audio version of it, specifically in South Africa, knowing that podcasting isn't that big here?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, I've been listening to podcasts since 2008, 2009, when it was really a niche thing. I mean, I think then your only option was to stream it off the website, because I think it was writing excuses. I always wanted to write a book, and I'm probably never going to start. But I've been listening to these authors chatting about how it's done. And at about the same time, I started the website, Urban Astronomer, was International Year of Astronomy that year. And I found it was the more work I put into it, the more content I produced, even if it wasn't that great, the better the traffic was, the better the feedback. And over the years, it's just been drifting, because as I've been getting busier and busier, I was putting less in, I was getting less out of it, and then just losing interest. And I'd wanted to start a podcast for years and years and years, because by that point, I was listening to very many of them, and I thought, I can do this. Maybe not as great as I'd planned from the beginning, but I'm definitely learning, and I'm getting there. And I actually started a podcast last year with my wife. It was just, we were never quite sure what the focus was going to be, so we drifted from various things. I think it ended up just being discussions about parenting, because kids, right? So we know what we're doing. and she works. One of her major freelancing gigs is writing feature articles for a parenting magazine. But even then, that's I think two people chatting in a sort of talk show format. I think it's easy to do. It's easy for people to respond to, because you're speaking naturally, so it sounds like actual people talking. Could never schedule a time.
Yeah, I see Grant Williams is actually asked in. Yeah, I see Grant Williams has actually posted in the feed here, advertising Australian untouched gold mine in South African podcasting. It is, which is, when we go back to, a point where you kind of can leverage of a big media house like us with NAG, it really does help a lot. As Richard said, I mean, aligning yourself to a Facebook page that already has 20,000 likes versus starting it off with you being a host of a page or a website where you're the first person there and you need to try and grow it from that point. It really does have its advantages from that point onwards.
There's a very different landscape in South Africa when it comes to monetizing things that I've seen overseas. A lot of big podcasts overseas, or independent podcasts, do things like Audible and Squarespace affiliation links and getting their income that way. We don't have access to a lot of that stuff, and a lot of the ways that our independent broadcasters and podcasters' work is a much more targeted. We will give you X, or we will pay you X to include us in a pre-roll or in an organic spoken advert during that podcast, or to include our logo in your cover art, or a bit about us in your episode description. So it's a lot less affiliate based and a lot more targeted, brand targeted, and it's both endemic and non-endemic. So I see from both sides where we get I've always sort of been of the opinion that I don't really want to monetize the podcast, because it is a hobby, and like, you know, you get that thing where once you start working for something, it becomes a job, and then you lose enjoyment for it. So, but when I do get approached by brands, or I approach brands to try and get a bit of traction in the advertising space, it's never affiliate based, and it's never sort of, we will give you X if you can give us X. It's always just, you know, it's a relationship that grows with you. So I've had, I think, 3 sponsors approach me, and none of them have ever asked me for metrics or sort of listener numbers or anything. They just don't, like, it's just not something, because they know that they're getting into something that's not, you know, accepted as a big thing yet. So when I tell people the metrics, often they're surprised by them, because like Grant, who's in the chat room, said, like, people don't know what podcasting is here. It's just something that is so strangely globally old, and I'm quite interested to see a lot of the comments through the day that people have been saying that that internationally it's actually not as well known as I expected, because coming from, you know, a South African who only sees what's sort of advertised and you know, pushed to me online, to me it looks like podcasting internationally is big, and we sort of, I always wonder how we just haven't really caught that bug yet, like it has been caught overseas, because it is such an accessible medium.
I really do think it comes back to the earlier point of us saying that data and internet access here, as much as it becomes a problem all over the world in certain areas, it is a major problem here. Many people don't have access to internet, or data is super expensive. So if you do have access, you're not typically going to be spending it on listening to a podcast or live streaming something or watching a video podcast. They're rather going to be spending it on other things and doing varsity homework or something like that. So I definitely think that plays a big role in coming back to the developing markets of South Africa. It's always going to come down to the fact that data is expensive. And I feel like I've repeated myself since the beginning, but I know we've picked up a couple of listeners. So it's definitely interesting to, I mean, we were freaking out this evening about a lightning storm and worrying about LTE. And I know we have listeners that are like, well, their internet can't be so bad. The average standard ADSL line here is a 2 meg line. And that's like stock standard. That's nothing fancy. That's just if you have internet at home and you can pay, if you don't want to pay an arm and a leg, that's kind of the line you get. And you can barely do anything with that, to be honest.
The fact
it's
that
also
the
worth mentioning
standard is ADSL is bad enough.
Yeah, exactly.
It's also worth mentioning that we're sitting here with our internet connections, income-wise, in South Africa, we are the 1%. You know.
Yes.
I mean, the vast majority are living. Well, they're not living in a house with reliable electricity, or, you know, I mean, it's a regular issue on the news. There's people protesting because the electricity hasn't been hooked up yet after 20 years. It's a common problem here, and our population is a certain size, but only a small percentage of that is even a potential listener.
Yeah, it's very true. Speaking of listeners, there was also a question in the chat now asking me specifically if I'm finding my YouTube audience is coming over to the podcast in significant numbers. I would say there has been kind of an overflow of people moving between different audiences and being on a podcast with both Richard and with Andrew, because that we tap into different niche audiences within that. Because I mean, Andrew's very big in one specific esport title that I've never been involved in before, whereas I'm involved in another one. So there has been a number of crossovers where people are saying, cool, I found out about you last week, or I heard you on the podcast, had no idea you were doing that, or I started listening to the podcast because you mentioned it in a video. So there is that crossover, but it's not very big, because I've found people have a social media and a medium of their choice. So if you're listening to a podcast, it's because you like podcasts. If you're watching live streams, it's because you like live streams. If you're going to troll on Twitter all day, that's what you like doing. So it's definitely, people become very siloed with, they don't want to explore every medium that there is on the internet, because I think it's also very saturated with, there's so much content being pushed to us that it's... I don't know. It's tough to say, yes, there has been growth, but there also has been, but it's not stable, if I can put it that way.
That makes sense.
I think it's up to us as well to kind of make our product as accessible as possible, which is why we started to produce a video podcast. We haven't had one go up yet, but we started to sort of experiment with it, and that sort of gives, you know, those people that spend their entertainment time is on YouTube, then it gives them an outlet to watch it. So because who sits at a computer and listens to a podcast? It sounds like a very strange concept to most people. But you'll sit and watch the radio. You'll sit and listen to the radio, but you won't sit and listen to a podcast. And why is that sort of, you know, why is that something that happens? And it's up to us to kind of make our product accessible. And the way to do that is to not make YouTube people move off YouTube, to put your podcast onto YouTube. And a lot of people do that. So, you know, by adding video and adding your product onto YouTube, it means that you're tapping into their need for a visual experience. You're tapping into their need to not give up their YouTube, you know, way of consumption. And it also allows you to get your product to more than one audience, because you've got the audio audience who listen to podcasts while they're driving, or while they're, you know, looking after the kids, or vacuuming, or hoovering, depending on where you're listening from, and the people that refuse to leave YouTube to consume media. So, you know, it's about balancing how much effort you put into throwing your thing into 12 different places versus how much each place is giving you in terms of audience.
Yeah, I think also going on to that is because of our market, we tend to target a lot of the gamers. And yeah, locally, I think our rough gaming age is about 23, 24. And it also goes back to...
how it's probably quite broad. I think the last time I looked at those sort of figures, it was 18 to 35 was our biggest.
And you can't forget about the 12-year-olds. Don't forget about the 12-year-olds online either. As a gamer, don't forget about them. They're there. I don't think they're listening to the podcast though. I think that it's out of their range of spectrum, I guess.
Yeah. Well, then my kids spend their days on YouTube when they can, watching Minecraft YouTube. They got their 2 or 3 channels they watch.
Kids just watch Minecraft stuff. It's so amazing.
I mean, the 2-year-old and the 4-year-old aren't interested, but the rest of them, yeah, they would sit there glued all day if we let them.
I love Minecraft.
Yeah.
What ways do you give your listeners to interact with you? What sort of ways of interaction do you promote?
I should probably focus on one, but since I'm not sure what's the most popular is yet, I take a shotgun approach. You know, I'll say you can tweet me, you can find my Facebook page, you can leave a comment on the show notes at the websites, and I recite the address, and I give my email address as well. And feedback has been email and the occasional, email and comments on the page, which is odd because those kind of almost feel anachronistic these days, you know.
Yeah.
Well, clearly that's the audience you're reaching. It's the medium they prefer.
Older.
Yeah.
People about
I don't want to say it. I was going to say the millennials don't like anything that requires them to have to go to a link and then click on something. They just want to be able to and hashtag. Speaking as a millennial, just saying.
Well, I suspect the website commenters are people who are already fans of the website. I haven't actually asked them, but although that seems weird because before I started recording, I was down to an update maybe every 2 months. So I'm astonished I even had an audience left after that. And maybe the podcast is what's brought them back. Who knows?
Interesting.
Yeah, I mean, our tag-off lines are pretty much just Twitter because we find that to be the most interactive. And like I said earlier, our interaction is really creating a brand that is a personal brand, sort of feels like the way that is the most successful in getting people to tune into or to listen to our podcast over listening to the news, the gaming news wrap up daily on whichever radio station is their one of choice, you know. So yeah, it's for us, it's the most personal way we can interact is the one that we promote the most. And like I kind of am quite strict with the tagline, the sign-off line on the podcast, and only letting people give their Twitter because then it concentrates our feedback into one place. And because of the age audience and because of the kind of audience that we have, they're almost all on Twitter anyway, so it works for us.
And I think it also allows for the listeners, the people that are actually consuming the product, allowing them to interact like that makes them feel as if they're also part of the podcast, that they're actually adding some value to it. And I feel that if your listeners feel like they can be part of the podcast, they'll feel more invested in referring it on or sharing it or just consuming the then as well.
I have 2 points to comment from that. The first is you need to create a product that when you see something on social media, what is the reason you shared it? It's because you want to have other people experience the same thing they just experienced. So you need to create something that's shareable and will make people be like, oh, that's something I really want to share with the rest of my friends, my family, my followers. The second point is how we do a thing, I want to say November every year, where we do our game. First week of December, yes. I like how you know what I'm thinking about already. We do a game awards where we actually release a Google Docs link and say, cool, well, here's all the categories. Give us your votes, and then we'll have an episode where we've just dedicated to the results of that game of the year and like most feels game and all of those things. And I don't remember the numbers from last year, Richard. You might be able to remember more, but I want to say we got over 100 responses.
There was 800 votes in total. Yeah.
There we go. So it's definitely something very cool to get your audience involved, and that's only something we do once a year. So maybe we look into involving that more and get more feedback that way. I don't know. It's a fun thing we do.
Yeah, one of the things that we are concentrating on a lot at the moment is audience participation and engagement. It's like to have an audience of I assume more than 1,500-ish people that consume your media, and only have a handful of them that engage with you is kind of disheartening. So something that I've looked at, and I know Chantal and I have sort of brainstormed a bit about, is getting that engagement up. And any suggestions anybody has, you're more than welcome to send them my way, because it's a really challenging.
My own musings there with getting feedback is that I think most people are going to be entirely passive in how they consume what you're producing. So 100 listeners, you can't really expect to get any feedback. If you've got 100,000 listeners, you can expect your lines to be quite busy, I think. So there has to be a certain minimum amount, a minimum size audience to work with to get that engagement. That small handful of extremely involved and having vocabulary trouble here. People who, engaged, people who really care about what you're saying and feel a part of it. So I suppose, if you're small, you put that energy into it, which is exactly what I'm trying to do, because I am sub 1,000 listeners. I'm probably maybe 300-400 downloads a month. It's small, but I am getting feedback, which is maybe almost undermining what I've just been saying. That you actually can get feedback from a small audience.
Yeah, the chats are saying it's not unusual to have a small percentage of audience members that actually engage. And this is from a 10 years worth of experience from JD. So that makes us feel a little bit better about ourselves. Thank you. Us all the way at the tip of Africa. Thank you. We appreciate it.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Don't know if there's anything else that people want to ask or whatever, but yeah, I think that that's one of the ways that we're trying to grow the podcasting into like an emerging market where we as South Africans are still very new to like the internet world and media that can be consumed from that. So I think engagement is one of the key ways that we grow the podcast that we're part of.
Engagement and consistency. Since our podcast is, unless something goes drastically wrong that week or the week of recording, then you can expect it at 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock on a Friday morning every week. And
I always used to laugh at YouTubers that I interact with, and they always go like, "No, I've got to have my video up at 3 o'clock on this afternoon because that's when people expect it." I'm like, "Oh, come on, you could put it up at 2. Nobody would care." And then the more that I produce these things and the more that I put them out, the more I realize how consistency is so important, and like being able to give your audience what they're expecting when they're expecting it, and it's incredible. It really is incredible. And on that note, that's one of the last points that I actually wrote down was to use the skills of your co-hosts. I mean, my role as producer, Chantal's role as being very creative and very in touch with how these sort of things work. And Andrew has a big relevance and he has a nice sense of humor that we like to tap into. So, like using the skills of the people around you that you have at access to at all times. Really important. But yeah, consistency.
And I think also
thanks
just
for driving that home, Chantal, for me.
Oh, you're welcome. I also just think that what's great in a team scenario is each of us have a say. It's not like dictated with like a stick to say, no, we will do it this way. If we have an opinion, either Andrew or myself, we're more than willing to take it to Richard and be like, here you go. Idea. Do you want it?
Yeah.
No?
I would
Yes?
totally be a control freak if I was.
So
I pretty much say no to all of them, don't worry.
pretty much. There have been some wacky ones, but I still have relevance in knowing that my ideas were heard. Not always implemented, but heard.
Well, I appreciate everybody coming in from South Africa. You guys have been genuinely fun to listen to. I think one of the great comments from Grant Williams in our chat room says, I think the greatest asset of the podcast team is their genuine authenticity. It really shines through. And I think that's very reflective of your personalities, the content that you guys produce. And I think with that genuine authenticity, you've mentioned the struggles of growing the podcast space and interest in South Africa. But I think as you continue to produce great content, that you create information that people want to listen to, that they want to share, that it's engaging and relevant to them, I think you're going to see a incremental growth in podcasting in South Africa. So before we head out this hour, I want to give each of you just a real quick minute to say where they can find your work at. We'll go ahead and start with Alan, a website, wherever it may be.
The primary source is www.urban-astronomer.com/podcast, or just click on the podcast link. And you can find me on Twitter as well at @uastronomer.
I do this every week, so it's kind of easy for me. You can find everything you need to know about NAG at facebook.com/NAG magazine, on Twitter at NAG0ZA, and on the web at facebook.com. On web at nag.co.za. And my personal Twitter is at Beetle001.
Yep. As Beatles already mentioned, where you can find all the NAG stuff, I often share the stuff as well on my Twitter at @thepenguinZA.
And then last but not least, the Rose. Once again, I have been Shani_ZA. So it's CHANI_ZA on literally everywhere on the internet. So go stalk me. It's fun. Not really.
Well, thank you, Alan. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Shani. And of course, thank you, Richard, for joining in. We truly appreciate having you guys debut South Africa on our International Podcast Day event. Thank you all for tuning in so much. As we break into our final 8 hours of podcasting, celebrating International Podcast Day, we encourage everybody to use #International Podcast Day. Thank you again from the bottom of our hearts, and we will see you in a few minutes.
Great.